Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're diving back into one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is World War I, and we're going to do it through the lens of alternate history. I know not everyone's into alternate history, but I think it gives us a really unique way of looking at actual history by examining how impactful certain moments were by looking at how they could have turned out differently. So it's just a unique way to study actual history, but also to kind of creatively think about what might have happened, because there's so many times in history where little decisions or even major decisions could have gone a different way and very nearly did go a different way and could have completely changed the outcome of everything that came afterwards, because everything is connected. The world today looks completely different, for example, if the United States never enters World War I. It's easy on the surface, if you don't really kind of take a deep dive into World War I, to think that, well, the U.S. was only really militarily involved for the last 6 or 8 months in a major way, and really, comparatively speaking, suffered few casualties. And so it might be tempting to think that American involvement in World War I didn't really change the outcome that much. But that would be to deny how much of, for example, German strategy was determined by the looming entrance of the United States into the war, and how that really did have an impact on the outcome. So I'll be curious to see what Alternate History Hub has to say about this topic. As always with alternate history, this is all subjective. It's a matter of opinion. My disagreements with Alternate History Hub that may or may not happen throughout this video are not a judgment on his conclusions. They're just a differing opinion, and we are all free to have those, and I would love to hear yours. So in advance of watching this video, which I haven't seen yet, just came out a couple of days ago, already has 500,000 views, I'll just say I would love to hear your thoughts. Who do you agree with? Do you think I'm right? Do you think he's right? Do you think neither one of us are right? Do you have a different idea of how this could have all gone down? Links in the description if you want to check it out, and all his other great alternate history content. Let's dive into this one. And the irony is not lost on me that I'm wearing a jersey of a German team today, Hoffenheim. So complete coincidence that it happened on a day that I'm reviewing something related to Germany and the United States being at war with each other.
World War I. The Central Powers lost. Spoilers. Just 3 years after Franz Ferdinand got shot, Europe was already reaching its breaking point. The Central Powers were almost falling apart, Germany was suffering food shortages due to the Baltic blockade, and both Austro-Hungary and the Ottomans were on the brink of collapse.
That said, so were Russia and France. France is dealing with internal issues, not to the degree that Russia is, but France is dealing with mutinies. They're dealing with men who are just fed up and not going to take it anymore. And they're very nearly there themselves.
Entente wasn't much better off.
There you go.
Russia got so tired of fighting other people, it withdrew from the war to fight itself. France and the UK were going deep into debt to pay for food and war material, while morale on the front lines slowly eroded. But both sides believed they could still win, or at least survive longer than the other. And so they fought on, with no end in sight. Then Uncle Sam joined the fray. The Entente's morale was boosted tremendously, as millions of fresh American soldiers began mobilizing.
And that's what I was saying at the beginning, is that even if you look at the actual military component, and the contribution made by the American troops when they arrive in force throughout 1918, the psychological component is massive. Not only, as he said, for the Entente and their morale, knowing that millions more troops are about to arrive on the Western Front, and maybe for the first time in the war they're going to have a distinct manpower advantage, but it also has an impact on the Germans, who have to kind of hurry up and try to win the war before the Americans can arrive in big numbers.
The Central Powers' morale cratered. Germany launched a desperate last-ditch spring offensive to break the Entente lines.
And this is really a series of offensives. They call them the Kaiserschlacht, or the Spring Offensive, or the Ludendorff Offensive. There's a lot of different names, and there's like 5 of them. There's Blücher and Operation Michael, and there's all these different ones. And one of them is going to culminate in the Americans' first real significant and well-known involvement, though what we're talking about is Belleau Wood. But if you've seen the Great War documentary, which I'm in, and I'm really proud of how that all turned out, that was on the History Channel back in May, you know that what the Americans initially do is they're plugging the gaps. They're giving a division to the French and a division to the British, and they're offering troops wherever they're needed, even though Pershing, the American commander-in-chief, really wants the Americans to have their own sector of the line where they can fight under American command. Early on, though, they recognize that's not really feasible. So they're involved in the Somme, for example, and there are Americans that fight in the Aisne Offensive and in these different places.
And take Paris before the Americans could arrive. It didn't work. The lines held, the Rohirrim arrived, and the Central Powers accepted defeat. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, thanks to Uncle Sam tipping the scales, the war to end all wars ended until the next one. In the aftermath, Europe had suffered 4 years of war, so it was kind of riddled with devastation and economic and social instability.
Yep.
But hey, the US joining at least got it over with, shortened what could have been a longer and more devastating war. And while stability, for most of the nations, is good, stability is no fun. So let's have some fun. Let's make it worse. So here's the thing. America really didn't want to join the war. I made an entire video on how most of the US, especially Woodrow Wilson, was hell-bent on staying out of the conflict. In short, the average American didn't really care about Europe. They didn't see a reason why they should cross the ocean to fight in the deadliest war in human history.
Yeah, and think about this. We have a mindset today where we are used to the idea of the United States being involved militarily all throughout the world, but that was not the case in 1914. The U.S., for the most part, had stayed out of that stuff, and they had expected Europe to stay out of our stuff. It goes all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine. It was this idea that they are their own problem, and we will deal with the problems in North and South America. Now, the United States had started to branch out a little bit with the Spanish-American War in 1898, so we're fighting against a European nation, but we're doing most of that fighting in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. It's not us sending the military over to Europe. But by 1914, it's starting to become more of a global, connected world where problems in Europe start to become our problems. And when the United States starts to get kind of tugged into it here and there, Americans dying on things like the Lusitania and the Housatonic. You have the Zimmerman telegram where Mexico is being encouraged to attack the United States if it comes to that. And there had already been some conflict on the Mexican border anyway. It was a different world.
Because some princeling got shot in Bosnia? Where's that? I live in Missouri. Wilson believed the US was morally above war against Europeans and should instead only participate as a mediator in the peace deal.
Yeah, that was Wilson's thing. I don't want to have to deal with the fighting, but I want to be involved in what happens afterwards, and I want to control the peace. And I think that probably motivated him in part to actually finally get into the wars. He wanted to help shape the post-war world. He had a bit of a messiah complex about those kinds of things. But also understand that it was no sure thing that if the United States got involved, which side it would get involved in. This is not World War II. This is not black and white. Central Powers are the evil guys, and the Entente are the good guys trying to save the world. It's much grayer than that. And the United States has more German Americans than any other single immigrant population. So there are a lot of German Americans who aren't too eager to see their newly adopted country go to war with the country they came from.
Fortunately for Wilson, Germany couldn't have done a worse job for PR.
That's
but they
true.
were really good at forcing the US to join the war. That was the one thing they were good at. At the start of the war, Germany used unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, sinking any ship suspected of carrying war material to the UK, whether it flew the flag of a neutral country or not. This included sinking the Lusitania, which killed over 100 Americans. The American public
And was totally carrying munitions. And listen, I mean, I will say this till my dying day. There are a lot of things you can criticize Germany for, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking. Speaking of which, man, anybody got a quarterback the Browns can have? lot of Monday morning quarterbacking to go back and criticize the unrestricted submarine warfare because we know that it was a big contribution to the United States getting involved in the war. But at the time, what else could Germany do? They were being blockaded. They were being starved out by the British Navy. They couldn't go toe-to-toe with the Navy. The one time they did was Jutland, and that caused them just to park their fleet for the rest of the war for the most part. But they did have U-boats in big numbers, and they could use them. And so in their mind, and I think correctly so, their unrestricted submarine warfare was really no different than what was happening with the British blockade. It was their version of a blockade. And they gave plenty of warning to people traveling on those ships. Listen, if you come into this exclusion zone on one of these ships that could be potentially carrying munitions, you might get sunk. They were running ads in newspapers in New York warning people of this.
Public was understandably not happy about this and forced Wilson to warn Germany to stop sinking neutral ships. A slap on the wrist. Germany agreed, temporarily, but by 1917 they started doing it again. Of course, they knew this would anger the Americans, but instead of doing anything sensible, Germany sent the infamous Zimmermann telegram to Mexico, asking them to attack the US to keep them from joining the war. Honestly, this is one of the most perplexing decisions I've ever seen a modern nation do.
I disagree with that. I don't think it was perplexing. Again, I think it makes sense. The U.S. and Mexico, remember, it's been 70 years since the Mexican-American War at this point. A lot of territory had been taken from Mexico in the aftermath of that war. In European minds, 70 years is not a huge deal. It's not a significant amount of time. And so they're looking at this and thinking, okay, it hasn't been that long. Would you like that territory back? By the way, we know that you've been dealing with some conflict on the border. There was the Mexican Punitive Expedition led by John Pershing that had sent American troops into Mexico, which was dealing with a civil war. And so there's already some bad blood between the U.S. and the Mexicans. And so the Germans are trying to capitalize on that. And they're thinking if we can keep the U.S. occupied, the U.S. has a really small army at this point. They're nowhere near ready to fight in Europe. And if they've got their hands full with their southern border, maybe it slows them down. This all makes complete sense if you're the Germans. The problem is, number one, Germans couldn't send this directly. They had to piggyback on other undersea cables because their lines of communication had been cut with the West. And so the British intercepted this and turned it over to the Americans. And when the Americans confronted the Germans about it, they're like, yeah, we totally sent that. I mean, they just flat out admitted it. That was the mistake.
Why would you ever think this was a good idea? When this became public, Wilson's hand was forced. He declared war. Also, let's get this out of the way. Mexico wasn't going to attack America to reclaim Texas and all of this.
They definitely could have sent raids because there had already been raids by Pancho Villa. And so if one revolutionary was launching raids into the Southwest and caused the mobilizations of hundreds of thousands of American troops before the war started, well, tens of thousands, we didn't have hundreds of thousands, but they're calling up militia. My kid's great-great-grandfather was in a Pennsylvania National Guard cavalry unit, and he got called up to be sent down to the border for this in 1916. And so it definitely would have kept the U.S. busy.
Kind of like asking an amputee to sucker punch Mike Tyson. But here's the question you actually care about. What if Germany was just a bit less careless? What if they never resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and just didn't send the Zimmermann telegram? Let's imagine a world where no matter what, Wilson gets his wish, and the U.S. sits out the Great War.
Everybody talks about the Lusitania, but that happened in 1915. That was before unrestricted submarine warfare was even resumed. So I feel like that had less of an impact, the Lusitania specifically, than people realize. It was the potential of more Lusitanias, I think, that kind of got people going.
Now what? Without Uncle Sam rushing in with his trusty war crime grade shotgun, the Central Power...
What? That one might get bypassed, but that was actually true. The Germans actually did complain that Americans using shotguns, that was a war crime. The same Germans who started using chlorine gas on the Western Front in April of 1915 complained about shotguns being war crimes.
Powers now have a real chance at winning the war. I mean, hell, look at a random Emperor Tiger Star video and pause in mid-1917. You could assume they had the war in the bag. And
Nice shout out to Emperor Tiger Star there.
The loss of the broken down Russian ally was replaced with a shiny American one. Without the US, 1917 is just kind of a year of losses for the Entente.
Yeah.
In April, the Nivelle offensive was a major flop, leading to mass mutinies in the French army. Germany unlocked chemical warfare with mustard gas, and who could forget the 473rd Battle of Isonzo, which...
The 473rd, there were like a dozen or more battles of Isonzo. That's Austria-Hungary and Italy in the mountain region there on the border. It just was a nightmare scenario. He's 100% right, though. Mustard gas is new. It comes in later after chlorine gas and phosgene gas and tear gas. What made mustard gas particularly horrible is that a gas mask didn't necessarily help you, because if it got on your skin, if it stuck to your clothes, and then you took your gas mask off later, it was still a problem. It just was nasty, but gas didn't kill that many people. Like 10,000 people died from gas attacks in the Great War, and most of them were Russia lost more than anybody else. It was the psychological effect that it had on the army more than anything. But yeah, he's right. The Nouvelle Offensive is a disaster. This French general thinks that he's just going to win the war in a couple of days, and it goes horribly wrong. And this leads to these mutinies, and the French army basically says, we'll defend from now on, but we're not launching any more offensive like that.
Utterly shattered the Italian lines.
Yeah, Passchendaele.
On the flip side, you had Brazil declaring war on Germany, sending a whopping 24 officers to assist the French. Good job, guys. Jokes aside, things were really looking bleak for the Entente, and you can get an idea for their desperation by looking at the tens of thousands of troops they sent to the sinking ship that was the Russian Civil War, supporting an autocrat in the hope that he would bring Russia back into the fold. Yeah, that sure worked out. We look at 1918 today knowing that the end was near, but on the day, nobody was ready to give up. Every front mattered. In our timeline, America put its hand on the scales, and in a bid to take Paris before they came in, Germany threw everything in the kitchen sink with its spring offensive that disastrously failed. That included hundreds of thousands of Eastern Front veterans who had just joined the Western Front. So
yeah, when Russia is out of the war, Germany takes something like 50 divisions and rushes them from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. They know the Americans are coming. They know by the end of 1918 it's going to be an untenable situation. They have to win now. Take that out of the equation, and you don't have to be so quick to launch a disastrous offensive.
Alright, so where was I? Oh yeah, grueling trench warfare filled with blood, sweat, and mustard gas, and Eastern Front reinforcements. But you know what? While many World War I speculations boil down to buffing or removing the spring offensive altogether, rather than witnessing another timeline where tens of thousands die for a plot of land not big enough to bury them, why not do something as realistic, but more creative? Now, this doesn't leave us with a lot of options, but what it does allow me to do is to finally make a video on the war in Gaza. That's right, Britain took over Gaza in 1917, made the Balfour Declaration, and then quickly took over Jerusalem too from the Ottomans.
Yep.
But with German aid to the Ottomans, this video could... Yeah, no, I'm still not touching that topic. We need to go somewhere a little more stable, a little less contentious. Let's talk about the Balkans.
There you go.
Let's go back to where it all began. Now remember, no America joining in 1917 means that over 1 million soldiers from the Eastern Front are redeployed.
Now, I will say one thing as I'm thinking to where he's going with all this. There is still one way in which the Germans are going to have a bit of a timeline crunch as far as, you know, we're thinking about, well, they rushed to try and win on the Western Front because the Americans were coming. It doesn't mean that Germany can just sit back and wait 3 more years. They've still got a blockade to deal with. They've still got a home front where people are starving. So there's still some of that going on. But that said, when they win the war on the East and Russia's out, There are some territorial concessions, which include some parts of Belarus and Ukraine where there's some food available. So that might slow the crisis a little bit. But I'm interested to see where he's going with this. If he's thinking keep the Western Front stable and maybe exploit somewhere like Isonzo or the Balkans, that'd be interesting.
Most go to the Western Front, some go to Italy, and 100,000 elite troops and a lot of equipment arrive to the aid of Bulgaria. Even in Kaiserreich, the Balkan theater of the war is overlooked. But what the Prussia of the Balkans was able to pull off was nothing short of extraordinary. That's right, we're talking about Bulgaria. Bulgaria is not talked about a lot, but the Bulgarians proved themselves to be way more reliable assets to the German war effort than Austro-Hungary or even the
100%
Ottomans.
true.
Opening a second front against Serbia ended its valiant last stand.
Yeah, Austria-Hungary could not deal with Serbia. It was only when Bulgaria comes into the war that suddenly Serbia collapses.
When Romania joined the Entente and invaded
Got overrun.
Transylvania, Bulgaria brought it to heel. The small nation of just 4.5 million people had mobilized 1.2 million men who fought like hell.
That's
and
insane.
in 1917, they managed to secure...
1.2 million men, that is probably more than your military age male population even is at that point.
Win against an expeditionary force from Britain and France, who
Valley
had
of Death.
superior numbers and equipment at the Battle of Doiran. Greece was tethering, caught between a Bulgarian invasion from the north and an Entente blockade in the south, which was applying pressure to the Greek king, who favored Germany. The Entente had committed just as many men to the Macedonian front as they did in Gallipoli, and in 1917, Germany was ready to match that. As far as realism goes, the Central Powers were already heavily assisting Bulgaria, providing military experts, equipment, materials, and multiple divisions. But here, we see them triple those figures by the end of 1917, as thousands trample over the remnants of Romania to join the war effort against Greece.
Totally plausible if you don't have a need to overrun the Western Front on a very specific timeline.
The Entente would also increase their support, but considering the bleak state of the Western Front, that increase would be minimal. Now I know what you're thinking, Jimmy. Germany up against the mighty 300 at the gates of Thermopylae? Not quite. Because the Central Powers didn't have to slog their way through all the mountains of Greece to get to the capital of Athens. They just needed to take Salonika, where the main Entente base was, barely 100 miles from the Bulgarian border. Sparta was a relic of the past, and Athens was the political center of Greece, but it was Salonika they needed to take. The Entente had stationed so many soldiers in the Thessalonian coastal city that the locals began to call them the Gardeners of Salonika. Spring 1918. Generals Otto von Bellow and Gorgy Todorov prepared 300,000 men for a joint invasion in Albania and Greece. At the center, we see what's left of the Serbian army fight tooth and nail against a formidable Bulgarian opponent. The Franco-British positions near the city are impenetrable, but over on the west, we are back to our good old spaghetti-eating friends, the Italians. With such a wide front against a foe that was literally bullied into joining the Entente, lines don't hold out for so long. And
I'm not sure I would agree that Italy was bullied into joining the Entente. Italy wanted something. They were, like a number of people in a number of wars, they were opportunists. There was territory they wanted back from the Austro-Hungarians that they thought was rightfully theirs. And so they wanted in. It was just a matter of which side they were going to be on. Because remember, a decade before that, they had been in a defensive alliance with Germany and Austro-Hungary as part of that triple alliance. So they were kind of on the fence, but they got pushed over the fence by the offers of what they wanted.
And when things go sideways, with morale at rock bottom, how hard do foreign expeditionaries really fight for Greek dirt? The German divisions take Ioania, Gastoria, and threaten Larissa, while Bulgaria completes the northern encirclement. Whether the pocket in the city withstands a prolonged siege with the aid of shipments is irrelevant. The road to Athens is open, and rebels begin chanting the name of their exiled king, Constantine. By the end of spring, the Entente defeat in Greece is assured, which leads to major repercussions. A separate peace is signed, and all foreign troops, including what's left of the Serbian Legion, sail away. Greece is forced to cede land in the previous Balkan wars to both Bulgaria and the Ottomans.
Now, I don't know how this would have worked with Greece, but the Entente did have an agreement in place that nobody was going to make a separate peace, that whatever they negotiated, it was going to be done all together. But in this scenario, I can see a situation where Greece would not be a part of that, and the world looks different as far as negotiating peace goes.
Greece would be forced to pay severe war reparations and demilitarize, and would find itself a lot less constitutional with a lot more monarchy, a German monarchy. That means that while life in the trenches was still one of the worst things imaginable, German soldiers could at least enjoy a nice bottle of olive oil, courtesy of their new protectorate. While the olive oil bit was a joke, seriously don't drink this stuff, it's also kind of not. Like in our timeline, after the fall of Romania, the Treaty of Bucharest was signed, and its terms were way harsher than that of Greece. Despite his German origins, the Romanian king was deeply invested in the national interests, so he was handed with a brutal ultimatum. Romania ceded territory, disbanded most of its army, leased all of its oil wells for a short 90-year contract, and also would remain under occupation until further notice. Greece would be getting off easy by comparison. Fun fact, those same wells would ironically keep the German tanks fueled for much of World War II. The treaty was signed in mid-1918, and for the following year, millions of oil barrels were transported to Germany, alongside a ton of grain. Now think about what
the grain matters more, because Germany doesn't have, they've got planes, but they don't really have much in the way of tanks. They really didn't use tanks all that much. So the need for oil, and they're not using their navy really, except for the U-boats. But in this scenario, they're not even using those as much. So I think the oil less important than the food.
What this means in this alternative timeline. A front line is closed. The Entente loses its two biggest allies and footholds in the east. A lot of resources make their way west. But the biggest impact here is psychological. On the inside, Germany is hanging on by a thread. Hundreds of thousands of dead civilians from malnutrition as a result of the Baltic blockade. The Ottomans are still struggling to deal with both Entente forces and growing unrest. And Austria-Hungary was on the brink of completely disintegrating. But that means little to the average Entente soldier. A soldier who keeps getting promised something bad will happen to the Central Powers, and it never comes. Meanwhile, their own news reports just show immediate disasters. Belgium, Serbia, Montenegro, Russia, Albania, and now Greece have all fallen. The Entente was losing on every single front in the war, with no hope in sight, and the Wehrmacht was only 50 miles away from Paris. At this point, the sunk cost fallacy that kept the
Had to pause for a second there because I was about to say something and I wanted to look it up to make sure that I wasn't wrong. The Wehrmacht is a World War II concept of the combined armed forces of the Germans. That was not a term that was in use during World War I.
The Entente going has kind of hit rock bottom. So what happens next? Keep in mind, if peace talks are announced, like morale plummets, leading to more mutinies like the one that followed the Neville Offensive. But the Western Front doesn't completely collapse. By the end of 1918, everyone was done with the war. America wasn't coming in on a white horse to help the Allies, and by almost every metric, the Central Powers were winning. For the most part, the key objectives of the Central Powers were achieved.
And remember that on the Western Front, almost all of Belgium is occupied by the Germans. A nice little chunk of France, eastern France, is occupied by the Germans. Germany, and that's why they tended to dig in a lot better, had better defensive structures, because they were the ones who controlled Entente territory, and they were really kind of daring the Entente to take it back.
Then some. In the peace, America might finally attempt to intervene, with Woodrow Wilson offering to mediate, laying out his 14 points for a lasting peace in Europe.
But who's gonna, it was bad enough that people didn't necessarily listen to him that much in the actual negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, but a non-involvement by the American military? Who's listening to Wilson in this scenario?
in the world, only for the Kaiser to dismiss him as a stupid Anglophile and toss his proposal into the nearest pigpen. With Wilson laughed out of the room, the real talks begin. Lorraine and Alsace are secured, and the subjugation of
And those already were under German control from the Franco-Prussian War.
Serbia, plus Brest-Litovsk, already exceeded expectations, and adding the rest of the Balkans and Belgium on top was just an added bonus. Since this point of divergence has a slightly less unhinged Germany, this increases the likelihood of Kaiser Wilhelm sitting down and jotting out a treaty which would still humiliate the Entente, but not do to them what they did at Versailles. Brest-Litovsk is reaffirmed.
It's Litovsk, Brest-Litovsk.
Belgium becomes a German puppet state.
I was going to say, I wouldn't expect Belgium to remain permanently occupied by the Germans. I don't think it's going to be annexed by the Germans, but a puppet state I could absolutely see.
Luxembourg and border territories of both France and Belgium are annexed into the Kaiserreich. The majority of Serbia and Montenegro enter the Austro-Hungarian Dominion. San Stefano, Bulgaria becomes a regional superpower. Romania and Greece become German puppet states. Germany takes colonies from Belgium, France, and maybe the UK to form a massive super colony in Africa.
Middle Africa!
From the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And finally, while the Entente threw Italy under the bus in our timeline, in this alternate timeline, the Central Powers do the same to the Ottomans. Sure, they don't lose land, but there is no way the British cede Egypt. So apart from a few Greek islands and some territory in the Caucasus, the Ottomans get a high five and a participation trophy.
The Ottomans were already supremely weak by the 20th century. They had lost wars in the Balkans. There was always going to be a situation where it was going to be a tough go for the Ottoman Empire to stay together.
So Germany becomes an economic empire with no economy, because world wars and empire building cost money, and no one has any. After 4 years of conflict and over 20 million people dead, almost everyone in Europe is pushed to, or in some cases over, the edge of collapse, all for some colonies to change hands, and more of Europe's ruling class to speak German. Even more than in our timeline, no one wins the Great War. Everyone loses. Some just lose harder than others. In our world, the war to end all wars ironically spawned the deadliest conflict in human history. But here, things kind of get messier. The Treaty of Versailles and Sykes-Picot drew lines in broad, linear strokes that defined the following 100 years.
Yeah.
But that's because the Americans and the British Empire were able to actually enforce it. What happens if the more unstable side somehow wins? Bulgaria is the one that comes out in the best shape, since the territory it gets are mostly of other Bulgarians, reconquests from lands that were lost. That said, they would be vilified by their neighbors, who, if they ever got rid of their pro-German government, would be very happy to dogpile at the first opportunity.
Remember that before World War I even started, there's a lot of conflict going on in the Balkans, and so it was always seen as a powder keg in Europe, and that was not going to change even after this alternate scenario.
But what about a dying Ottoman Empire with a young Turks movement and control over the Middle East? Who has to deal with the issue of Palestine? What about an Austro-Hungarian Empire who lost its charismatic and progressive prince, only to gain more angry minority groups, now including furious Italians,
Great
Poles,
questions.
and Ukrainians? And finally,
they already had Ukrainians, though. I mean, they had parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that included things like Galicia. But, yeah, I mean, Austro-Hungary was always going to have a hard time staying together, too, just because of that very multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-language nature of their empire. The German Empire was a different story because it was all Germans, even though there were different kinds of Germans. Germany absolutely, regardless of how weak they might be economically in the aftermath of this war, everybody else is too. As people start to rebuild, Germany is going to be the world superpower in this scenario.
Even more depleted Germany, still on the verge of democratic, socialist, and fascist uprisings, who now had colonies to govern.
They already had colonies. They had colonies before this war. They just have more of them now. And as I said about superpowers, remember the United States, one of the things that happens in the aftermath of World War I, even though we're not heavily involved militarily compared to the other countries, is that this is really what launches the United States on a massive world stage. and leads to the superpower that comes out of the Second World War.
Puppet governments to prop up, and millions of angry Bolsheviks on their back door. What happens is chaos. Sheer and utter chaos. Unless... Since the French Revolution, France has replaced its government every time it lost a war.
True.
And a couple of extra times just for sport.
And even when they didn't lose a war.
This would be no different. Yeah. The same would happen in Italy, which was teetering on the edge of civil war between socialists and Catholics when they won the war in the first place. Yeah, there would be full-scale coups and or civil wars in both France and Italy.
100%
adding to
yes.
the catastrophe that had already begun.
We saw that happen in places like Russia, and I mean, look at all the countries that were either on the winning or losing side. France nearly had a socialist government after all of this anyway. Germany undergoes a lot of upheaval in what kind of government they're going to have. The Russians obviously do. Ottoman Empire collapses. Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses. Massive upheaval for the losing side.
In Russia and Turkey. To put it bluntly, a devastated and bankrupt Europe is not good for business. And if America cared about one thing, it was business. With three great powers collapsing and potentially turning socialist, along with rising socialist movements in many countries throughout the world, the US would be in the middle of a much, much worse Red Scare.
Fair point.
In 1920, Woodrow Wilson is still in office, technically. And by that point,
his wife's in office.
Several anarchist bombings and the Palmer raids assured the arrival of the Red Scare in the US. It's notable to mention that the losses suffered in Brest-Litovsk take out 80% of the Soviet's agricultural sector, most of its coal and a good chunk of its population too. This nerfs the Bolsheviks and Russia as a whole, while adding a ton of dissent for Germany to deal with. On the other hand, leftist movements would be widely more popular in France, Italy, and still Germany. What this means is that the United States, in a panic, officially makes Germany its second biggest trade partner and does everything it can to prop it up.
Absolutely plausible. Honestly, of all the videos of his that I've reviewed so far, this one feels the most plausible to me. I haven't agreed with everything he said, but it's all very plausible.
They might not have wanted Germany to win the war, but since they did, well, you pick what you can get. After all, while Germany suffered material and manpower losses, the thing it needed the most was cash, and Uncle Sam could provide at least a good chunk of it.
Which Uncle Sam did, even in having been on the opposite side in the war in our real timeline.
This would keep Germany afloat for a few years, and by extension, Austria-Hungary, which would by this point only be in one piece because of Germany holding it together.
Yeah.
But further east, the rest of the alliance begins to crumble as far-left and far-right protests continue to destabilize German puppet regimes, and the Reich just doesn't have the manpower or willpower to preserve everything. But all it would take is one outburst from Wilhelm, one serious rebellion put down by force, or one key Bolshevik win for the Reich to implode. A step in any direction from this point is hard to predict.
Not entirely sure I agree with that, but...
and deserves its own video. But what we know for sure is that Lenin dies in 1924, with Brest-Litovsk being an even bigger disaster than in our timeline. Trotsky's fall and Stalin's rise is assured, and maybe that is when the powder keg explodes. Who knows? In any case, I hope you enjoyed this alternative take, which...
Alright, I agree with most of what he said there. I think it was a very plausible scenario. Little things I might quibble with, but nothing major. And again, it's all a matter of opinion. Anyway, so what do you think? What does the world look like if the United States does not get involved military in the First World War? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you have suggestions for other videos, let me know and we'll take a look at those. Thanks for watching.